Hey there, just wanted to give you some information about the Sony Fx30. There's a couple of misconceptions when people are asking questions. Some people are giving the wrong answers, and I can wholeheartedly tell you that I've done my research, and here are the questions and the answers. First question that was really important is when you're recording externally, like on an Atomos Ninja 5, are you getting the same quality as you would recording internally? And is it still getting that 6K downscaled to 4K? And the answer to that is yes to both questions. Yes, you're still getting 6K to 4K oversampling, and you're getting the same quality. Okay, so the other question that people were asking is, does this have dual base ISO? And the answer to that question is yes, it really does have dual base ISO. Also, in order to use dual base ISO, some people were having misconceptions as well and thinking, well, this dual base ISO is a lie. And it's not a lie, because what they were doing is they were using the shutter dial to change from 800 to 2500. You can't do it that way. In order to change between the high end and the low end of the dual base ISO, which is 800 and 2500, you have to use within the menu where it says base ISO, or bind the button to that base ISO switch. So as long as you're using that method to get to ISO 800 and 2500, you're in dual base ISO. You can't just slide the dial to change the ISO that way. That's only changing the exposure index only, and that's for other purposes. That's to be able to see what your image would look like changing the ISO to a specific value in post-production. It does not bake that into your footage. Okay, so another question people have is, do you have to use CF Express Type A cards in this camera to be able to record in the high-end values? In other words, 4K 120 or all intra or anything like that. And the answer to that is no. You don't have to use the CF Express Type A cards at all, as long as you use the SD cards that are UHS 2 V90 cards. Those are the rating cards that you're going to need to use. So also, when you're shooting dual base ISO like 800 and 2500, you're using Cine EI, because that's what you have to use to get dual base ISO. When you're shooting Cine EI Slog 3, probably the best exposure setting that you're going to get is from 1.3 to 1.7 stops over. That's going to give you the best results. You could still go to 2 stops over, but I wouldn't recommend that because you risk on clipping certain highlights and things like that. It's a little bit more work in post to bring down the exposure. I find it very easy to work with. I've shot a lot of things that are 1.3 stops over exposed, and then when I bring it in post-production, I just slide the slider down of exposure 1.3 stops, and it's right on the money. Okay, so the other thing is a lot of people don't really know about is the shutter speed versus the frame rate. Most cameras, Fuji X-T4, X-T3, Canon, Nikon, those cameras have even numbers for shutter speed. An example, shutter speeds 1/60, 1/80, 1/100, 1/120, etc. When you're shooting, let's say 30 frames per second, obviously you would double the value for shutter speed, so you would use a shutter speed of 60, and if you were shooting 60 frames per second, you would go 120. Shooting that way with those cameras, you would never get no banding or flickering if you're using lights indoors or something like that that are powered by the AC outlet. See, the AC outlet is alternating current, and believe it or not, even the lights in your living room doesn't matter. Any lights that's coming out from the AC outlet is flickering really fast, 60 cycles per second. So, and the human eye cannot detect that, but your camera can. So normally when people are shooting like at 30 frames per second, they set the shutter speed at 60, it's within sync of those 60 cycles, so you're not seeing the banding or the flickering. However, on this camera, for some reason, even if you're using shutter speed 60, as far as if you're shooting 4K 60 frames per second, you're supposed to go to 120 shutter speed. It doesn't have a 120, it has 125. So that makes it off a little bit. But it does have a specific menu within the camera called anti-flicker, and in there you can change the shutter angle. And I've tested these modes for each frame rate, and they're as follows. I'm going to give you the values. Okay, so in order to avoid banding, just simply, if you're, let's say, recording 30 frames per second, just having a shutter speed of 60 is not going to cut it. You're going to have to use the shutter angle and the anti-flicker menu, and you're going to have to turn that on. And you would set the shutter angle for 30 frames per second, 59.9, 59.95. So it's basically 59.9. If you're shooting 60 frames per second, and this is what works for me, you would shoot at a shutter angle of 119.9, which is almost 120, but 119.9 seems to get rid of the banding completely. If you're shooting 120 frames per second, that would be 239.9. Those are the values that you have to use in the anti-flicker and the shutter angle. If you don't use that, you risk getting banding, and you'll notice that. The other thing is, when you are shooting like Cine EI or Slog 3 or whatever it is, if you're shooting in Slog mode, you have an option to preview the Rec 709 LUT and the other LUT that they have in there built into the camera. They have the Rec 709 LUT. You can preview that. In other words, when you're filming, you can assign that to a button to switch over to turn LUT on or LUT off. All that does is let you preview the LUT on your monitor, on your screen, and to see what it's going to look like when you have it in post-production and apply the LUT. This does not bake it into the video recording. If you're shooting internally, it does not. However, if you're shooting externally to the Ninja 5 and you turn that LUT on to preview it, it's going to send that signal to the Ninja, and the Ninja is going to have that baked into it. And so you don't want to really turn that on using the Ninja. If you want to preview a LUT, the Ninja has an option to preview a LUT within inside the Ninja. You do that from within inside the Ninja's menus and not the camera. So do not press preview LUT on the camera when shooting externally, because that's going to bake that right into your footage. If you want it baked into your footage so you don't have to bother with that in post-production, you can do that, that's fine. However, I would not recommend doing that that way. I would just use the Ninja's menus to preview the LUT that way. That's the best way to do it. Also, speaking about LUTs, there's an option menu in the Sony Fx30 embedded LUT. People think that bakes that right into the video. It does not. It only bakes it into the metadata. So when you bring it into the software like Sony Catalyst Browse, you have an option to hit one button for it to get that information of that LUT and put it in there automatically without some extra steps. Pretty much that's what that is. So even if you have embed LUT on, and let's say you're going into Adobe Premiere Pro, from what I've seen and what I've done, it does not bake that LUT into the video footage, whether it's recording externally or internally. Okay, so there you have it. That is the Sony Fx30, the questions and answers that some people had, misconceptions. This is really a great camera. I've been using it for the past week, shooting different scenarios, and I'm going to be using it for the first time on a real shoot that I usually use my cameras for, and I'll be able to have some